I start, I would like to give very warm thanks to Macmillan Education, who have brought me here this morning to give this talk to you. And I wonder if any of you realise that the consultancy firm McKinsey has recently talked about 800 million jobs being at risk of automation. That actually any or many jobs that involve a process are likely to be overtaken by machine learning and artificial intelligence. Now let's just think for a moment what that means in employment terms for the little children that we have in our classes today. They're going to be growing up in a very different world, and we need to change our education system in order to emphasize the application of knowledge and skills rather than simply memorization and retention. And as David Richards has said recently, we need to refocus education on values, beliefs, teamwork, and independent thinking. My session with you this morning is basically looking to explore two questions. What kind of emergent thinking skills are young children really capable of? And what practical pedagogical strategies can we use to integrate the development of thinking skills into our pre-primary language programs? And I think I'd like to start off by also saying that what I mean by high quality thinking in this context is thinking, and I'm actually basing this on the work some of you may know of Carol McGuinness at Belfast University, that thinking is non-routine, it's independent, it involves effort, it is complex, it involves different options, multiple criteria, and working through problems that are challenging. So this is what we're working towards. And what kinds of skills are we seeking to develop in the future? Well, there are many different taxonomies of thinking, and actually, as has been said in the literature, they're often arbitrary and include and exclude different things. So here is actually a summary of the kind of skills that we're looking to develop. And I've put them inside SONS here because, importantly, it's not just the thinking skills that we're seeking to develop, but the dispositions, the learning dispositions that underpin them. Things like curiosity, perseverance, effort, willingness to listen to other ideas, to respect and tolerate other views. And so actually, let's move on and think about some examples of young children's thinking. And actually, what do they tell us? And in order to do this, I would like you to identify a thinking buddy for this session. I see some of you on your own, so would you like to move and just sit next to someone? Identify your thinking buddy. And I am going to give you 3 examples of children's thinking. And after each one, I would just like you to, with your partner, just think of one thing. I'm only asking you one because I'm going to give you a very short time, that jumps out at you about what they tell us about young children's thinking. These examples that I'm using are authentic examples from my own experience, because I prefer to use examples where I actually completely know the context in which they happened and what promoted the kind of thinking and so on. Okay, so the first example, are you ready for the first example? Have you identified your thinking partner? I'm not sure if yeah? Okay, good, brilliant, okay. So the first example then. Okay, mother, actually surprisingly a teacher trainer, actually preparing an introductory session on semantics for a diploma language course and reading one of those semantics books, you know, where you learn how we actually discover the meaning of words, so things like, plus fur, plus tail for a mammal, and so on, that kind of thing. And turns to young child and says, so what's the difference between you and a dog? Okay, it's a very young child. And the child thinks and thinks, and the person asking the question, which is me, thinks, oh dear, what is wrong with this child? Surely this is actually quite an easy question, plus waggly tail, plus fur. Okay, and the child thinks and thinks, and I feel more and more concerned. But actually, no worries, because I am a teacher, and I do know about thinking time and wait time, so I wait. And eventually, with a kind of eureka look on his face, he stands up and says, I can stand on one leg. Okay, so what does that tell us about young learner thinking, children's thinking? Just one thing to your partner. Okay, just one thing. Well, I think we can see from that example that the child has an ability to reason, has an ability to compare themselves to a dog, to apply the thinking, and actually has an ability to abstract, because they haven't got a flashcard of a dog or anything like that. So there is an ability to apply that thinking and do that kind of comparison. And I think also there is also an ability of the child to read or try and read the intention of the person asking the question. Why was she asking me that daft question? It wasn't just so obvious as waggly tail. So there was a lot of thought going into that. Okay, the second example coming up. The second example, at a dinner table, and there's a young guy there, 17, 18, just about to leave school, and the typical adult question he gets asked, so what do you want to do when you leave school? And he says, I want to be a doctor. And in order to deflect the question from himself, he turns to a 4-year-old girl, also sitting at the table, and says, so what do you want to be, Hannah? As quick as a flash, she says, I want to be a giraffe. And they say, oh, really? A giraffe? You want to be a giraffe? Why do you want to be a giraffe? And she says, yes, a giraffe is taller than a doctor. Yeah. Okay, so what does that tell us? Off you go, quick. Exchange what it tells us. Okay, so I think there we can see, we'll come back together. I know you've got lots to say. We can see that there is reasoning, there is abstraction, there is personalizing it and applying it to yourself. There is the kind of egocentrism that we associate with young children's thinking. And the answer is also quite creative, I think. She's come up with that, and she's also able to give evidence and give a reason for her ideas. Okay, so the very last example now, coming up, this one is in an art gallery, an exhibition. And we're actually looking at an exhibition of the work of Picasso and others, but mainly Picasso. And little girl comes up to me and says, Mummy, I don't think he's very good. I say, oh, really, darling? Why is that? Why don't you think he's very good? And she says, well, he doesn't even know how to colour in the lines. So what does that tell us, do you think? Off you go between yourselves. Okay, so I think these examples show that actually thinking is more complex than we often realize, and children are capable of much more than we sometimes give them credit for. And let's just have a look at what the examples highlight about children's thinking. And I think, first of all, the role of social interaction, that it is actually through the social interaction that the child's thoughts are prompted. And those of you familiar with the work of Vygotsky and other social constructivists will see exactly where that's coming from. The second point, that the intention of the interlocutor is crucial. Remember, in that I can stand on one leg example, the child thinking, why is this question being asked? And again, many of you will know that this is the basis of much of the criticism of some of Piaget's experimental work. So the role of the interlocutor, crucial. And what about also the role of significant adults? In that museum example, we can see how the child at school has learnt that actually it's one of the important criteria to be able to colour in the lines, and has taken that on board as part of their thinking. So that children, actually, they are imbibing the values that they get from adults. The next point, and I think this one is an important point in terms very often of our assumptions, that children are capable of not only concrete thinking, but abstract thinking as well. And there is research on this, which also shows how young children are not only capable of thinking in concrete terms, but they can abstract as well. I think these examples also show the potential for creative and critical thinking. I mean, the critical thinking, we might not completely agree with the criteria chosen by the children, by the child in the case of Picasso, but it's certainly an ability to critique and evaluate somebody else's work, for example. We've seen the kind of egocentric focus, you know, the child immediately thinking about herself, the typical one-upmanship of 4-year-olds in that giraffe example. So that children are learning to de-center, if you like, at this age. And I think these examples also reveal very much the complexity of children's thinking, that actually there's not one thinking skill going on here. There is a multiplicity of skills that interact together. And the last thing here I would point out is the uniqueness of children, that these children had these thoughts, other children would have other thoughts, and I think this is important for us to bear in mind when we're, for example, reading research. You know, how many children were involved? How much can we universalize from particular, you know, evidence that has been found? And I think actually that for many of us, we, you know, are thinking about thinking very often in a box. And we are very influenced by established theories and labels. If we just think of Piaget, for example, all those examples I gave you are by children who are pre-operational in his terms. Well, they seem pretty operational to me in terms of thinking, their quick thinking, and their responses. And similarly, it is rare to go to a talk on thinking skills these days and not to be presented with Bloom's revised taxonomy, presented in this kind of pyramid shape, which actually gives the idea that thinking is linear, sequential, step by step, hierarchical, and that we move from remembering to be creative in that kind of discrete order, when actually we've seen in the examples that I gave you, in the first one, the child is remembering what a dog is like, understands it, applies it to themselves, analyzes, and so on, and comes up with the answer. And I think, you know, thinking skills are a lot more complex than this, and I would also take issue with the way we divide this into lower order, those bottom three, and higher order thinking skills. And that lower order, you know, this is not Downton Abbey. You know, this is actually these skills, you know, remembering is hugely important for any kind of thinking that we do. And I would actually prefer to see these called something like CATS rather than LOTS and HOTS. And CATS would be with a K and would stand for key active thinking skills, for example. So I think we need to be aware of this complexity because it also, of course, impacts on what we can do in our classrooms. And moving on to developing an effective thinking pedagogy in our preschool classrooms, I think we need to bear in mind the triangular relationship between the following things. First of all, the learning environment. Very obviously, I think that the learning environment needs to have a positive, warm, and welcoming ethos. It needs to encourage thinking and interaction with the kind of displays on the wall, you know, can you guess which baby this is, that kind of thing, and also with children's work to develop self-esteem, and also thinking aids. For example, in preschool and pre-literate, you know, we might have pictures of some of the words we've learnt, for example. So we have the interaction between the learning environment and, secondly, and hugely importantly, the kind of teaching strategies that we use. Now, there are many, many of these, but for example, the way we create a positive, warm, caring environment, the way we explain what we want children to do, the way we model thinking out loud in a way that, you know, someone like Margaret Donaldson suggested really years back, and is obviously in the kind of constructivist tradition, you know, that helps children by explicit processes of thinking, the way we make our classroom into a community of inquiry and develop shared and sustained thinking, the way we use questioning techniques, for example, the way we scaffold and recast language, the way we give feedback, and the way we organize our lessons in terms of a learning cycle, which might be a 3-stage cycle, such as plan, do, review, or it might be a longer 5-stage cycle, you know, the tune in, engage, create, activate, reflect. I think I might have got them in the wrong order, but you know, that kind of thing. So the teaching strategies that we use, and of course, the strategies, the ability to monitor and evaluate the children's responses, because that is the next thing, the children's responses, because we have to remember that thinking is an internal process, and so we need as teachers to look for those indicators that demonstrate thinking. So this will be things like evidence of working memory, evidence of being able to do simple cognitive tasks, such as matching, sorting, sequencing, an interest in asking questions, persisting, taking risks, so the kind of evidence that we have of children's thinking. And so moving on to actually how it might work in the classroom, I want to introduce you to my quilt in the early years. Okay, and this quilt, a patchwork quilt that you can see here. And quilt actually stands for quality in learning to think. And the reason I've chosen a patchwork for this image, there are 2 reasons. First of all, it reflects an infusion approach to teaching thinking as opposed to a discrete approach. And this is a distinction made in the literature, and a infusion approach, what it means is actually looking for opportunities at every stage of our lesson as an integrated part of the pedagogical process to integrate the development of thinking, whereas discrete is to do with actually using specific techniques to develop specific thinking skills. So the quilt is the idea of the cover. And the other reason I chose a quilt is because patchwork quilts come in multiple different forms. They can be different materials, they can be different colors. The patches can be triangular, hexagonal, square, not circles. I was going to say circles. Well, that would be a harder patchwork to make. But the point is that every teacher, every child, every class is different. And we, as practitioners, we all need to create our own quilts in our own context to integrate thinking skills into our programs in the most efficient and effective way that we can in our classes. And so what I'd like to do now, because also that's what I was going to mention, that although as practitioners it's important for us to be aware of research, to read it, to understand the implications for our classrooms. But as Rod Ellis has said, that research is never going to give us recipes for successful practice. And so we have to take the bits that feel most relevant and appropriate to us in order to construct the kind of classroom that is most effective for us in our situation. And so actually what I'd like to go on to now is to introduce you to 4 patches on my quilt, okay? There are more, and I will tell you what the others are, but I'm going to talk to you about 4 of them. And the first one here is social and emotional learning. These patches are the things that I feel really underpin our ability to be successful in promoting high quality thinking in the early years. So social and emotional learning, a rather vast topic that relates to all of us, to do with managing and understanding, controlling our own emotions and feelings, to do with the way we relate to others, the way we establish relationships and maintain them, to do with the way we organize ourselves, the way we set goals, and the way we take decisions about things. And of course, something as vast as social and emotional learning, we need to actually unpick to make it relevant, unpack, well, both actually. Unpick's probably better for the quilt metaphor. Unpack what we mean by social and emotional learning and how it can be most relevant. And so just a couple of examples now. And the first example is actually to do with developing children's understanding of their own emotions and feelings. You know, sometimes at preschool there's a kind of tyranny of happiness. You know, teachers expect and want their children to be happy all the time. But actually life's not like that, and children aren't all happy all the time. They have other feelings as well. And actually learning to identify those feelings is an important first step in learning to manage them. And so we might teach children different feelings. For example, I don't know if my pointer shows, we've got happy yellow, sad blue, angry red, calm is green. We've got the purple there is sleepy, and the last one, grey, is scared. Okay, and so, for example, we might integrate these feeling words into our routines. We might do it with a puppet. We might pass the puppet, and you can actually tell the puppet, rather than the whole group, how you're feeling today, okay? We might also, well, we would also, in our case, we would sing a song and actually introduce that idea of sometimes I'm happy, sometimes I'm sad. I'm not always happy automatically. And actually, if you share some of your feelings with the children, they get the idea. So actually, when they come to do a little activity like this, what they're going to do is colour the circles that relate to them. Sometimes okay, they probably may end up colouring all of them, but actually what they're doing is thinking about their feelings. Sometimes I'm this, sometimes I'm that. Some children colour them all, some children colour 4 of them, and what they're also learning here, of course, is that life is not a series of right answers, that there is choice and autonomy, and they are thinking about themselves. And then what we might also ask them to do is colour this face to show how they're feeling now. And you know something really interesting that happens when you do this with children, that they don't automatically just colour the face yellow or colour the face green. They actually colour it 2 or 3 different colours. And then you can explore and get a little feedback. And this is where, you know, the importance of children's multilingual identities come in, because actually, you know, they're not going to be able to tell you in English, but they can tell you in another language. You know, for example, I feel happy today because I have, I don't know, a chocolate biscuit in my lunchbox. I feel sad because mummy can't pick me up from school today, something like that. So you're actually getting this understanding of their feelings. Okay, so moving on to another area of social and emotional learning that children really need to start on at this age is learning to cooperate. And we've seen already how egocentric children are, and that's not necessarily going to be very easy. But actually learning to cooperate, we can start off doing it even in sort of little action games, a little clapping game, for example. Would you like to turn to your partner now and be ready to do this with me? Okay, so let's work together. Let's cooperate. I help you, you help me. It's great, it's great. Okay, so you might do that before you start a project or something. And, you know, working in projects with children is an increasingly popular trend, but actually this is very difficult to do unless we really train our children. And the secret working with projects with this age group is actually to get children to do something individually that contributes to a final outcome. Okay, so moving on to thinking language, and I think the word cooperate in that line actually shows how important that is. And integrating language for thinking right from the start, so actually children are explicitly aware of those kind of processes that we can go through. And Astington has suggested that we teach things like cognition. Well, I've adapted this more suitable for ELT. Words to do with cognition, so words like think, know, guess, remember. Words to do with desire, want, need, like, love, for example. Words to do with perception. And that we actually integrate this into our teaching. So teaching from a very early stage, things like I think, I know, I don't know, that actually gives those discussion possibilities, even maybe why, because, or also doing little thinking routines, having actually a physical thinking hat, maybe if we're about to do something, finding out content about the world, for example. Let's put on our thinking hats. Think, remember, guess. Let's put on our thinking hats and do our very best, for example. We can also, as is probably familiar to you, borrow visible thinking routines, you know, based on the Project Zero Harvard materials, evidence-based approach to integrating thinking throughout the curriculum. The one you're most familiar is probably with See, Think, Wonder. This is a little example of Think, Puzzle, Explore, where I like to use the think as a way of activating that vocabulary that we taught the children. So I think meerkats have fur, for example. Not that they could say all of that necessarily, they might just produce the vocabulary. And then puzzle about meerkats. Why do they stand on 2 legs, for example? And then we're going to find out by watching a little video or listening to a little text. Okay, moving on very rapidly. So my lady with the timer, I can't see her. Okay, it doesn't matter, Okay, moving on to play and games. Really, really important for us in cognitive terms and language terms to make the distinction between play and games. So play, where children actually take on a role and are engaged in fantasy, imaginative play, and they use concrete items to symbolically represent other things. For example, a cardboard box can become a pirate ship, okay? And we contrast that with games, which is more like the typical thing that we do in language teaching. You know, we have a feely bag and flashcards inside, and we go, what's in the bag? Can you guess? It's a, and they all call out, and it's either yes, 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 or no. Okay, so those kind of, and we need to make a contrast, I think, between what each of those contribute to cognitive development. First of all, I mean, just very briefly, that make-believe or pretend play is, you know, it gives flexibility in thinking. It allows children to rehearse dealing with problems, dealing with emotions, dealing with conflict, whereas games with rules, the kind of cognitive development, is much more to do with pre-academic skills of following instructions, understanding the goal to be reached, and basic cognitive skills like matching and sorting, for example, in a memory game. In terms of language development, it is also different. With play, children have their whole linguistic repertoire available, and they are able to use language freely. They have ownership of the language that they use. And very interestingly, in research, it's interesting in free play how children very often correct each other. And I've also seen that in a situation in ELT where children are playing freely. Whereas the language development in terms of games with rules is much more structured, much more ordered. It's this vocabulary, it's this structure that we're practicing, and there is that kind of controlled repetition. We also can look at the different impact on social and emotional learning. Whereas with free play, children have an opportunity to develop their social skills, their empathizing with others, and their ability to work together and solve problems and so on. Games with rules, it's much more to do with actually you know, understanding about concepts of fairness, understanding that you're not always the winner in a game, and so on. And of course, actually, in ELT, we tend to use games much more than play. And the reasons for that, I think, are very clear. There are three main reasons for that. I mean, first of all, that when children are in free play, they tend to, when they're doing free play, they are, sorry, I'm just focusing on the lady there saying I must stop. They're focusing on free play cell, yeah, they're doing that. Whereas with games, I completely forgotten what I was saying, actually. I know I've got to stop, and I've overran. I'm really sorry. Okay, so just moving on very quickly to my last point, values education. Values education at this age to do with the child thinking about themselves, their behavior, others, and the world around them. So it's very much applying that thinking to yourself. And the two very quick examples here, developing values through stories, things like kindness, helping others, empathy, and so on. And also, of course, we can develop values through songs. And this is a song actually for children to develop a growth mindset. And what I would say about values, it's not a tick box. It's not a tick box of things you learn. It's the beginning of a process. And also, as adults, we mustn't focus on it too explicitly, because otherwise, as Bettelheim says, we rob children of the chance to internalize and develop those values themselves. Okay, so we've looked at 4 of my patches: social emotional learning, thinking language, play and games, and values education. Others, actually, there are 8 in all, and others are storytelling, interactive dialogues, reflection, and one other that I now can't remember, but never mind. Okay, you can always drop me an email to find out. Okay, so what I would just like to end on is going back to my patchwork, that this we all have to create our own patchworks. Every child, every class, every teacher is different. And so I know you normally don't get homework from IATEFL sessions, but I'm going to give you some homework for you to think about. And your homework is, what does your quilt look like? Okay, that's the end of my session. Thank you very much.